Thank you so much for coming. Today is a day when many of us might have wished to have stayed home and not brave the elements, so I especially appreciate you coming today. We're so honored to welcome Dr. Howard Frumkin, most recently from the University of Washington. So Dr. Frumkin actually started his professional career here at Brown as a concentrator in science and society. And it was interesting, I didn't even know that until somebody came to me and said, oh, do you know that Howie wrote the story about the beginnings of the Department of Health here in Rhode Island as part of his thesis? And so it's great to see somebody start at Brown and then come back after so many years. After that, he trained at University of Pennsylvania, got an MD, followed by a Master's of Public Health and a Doctor of Public Health at Harvard University. And his work then was really on environmental and occupational exposures, practicing environmental and occupational medicine. And then he went on to Emory University, where he started as assistant professor and became eventually chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health, before then moving to the CDC for 5 years, where he was director of the National Center for Environmental Health and also the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And perhaps sort of most notably in the context here is that he was also a special assistant to the director in the area of climate and health. And during that time, he started the BRACE program. This is an ongoing program of building resilience against climate effects. And it was CDC's attempt to, or actuality of funding research in implementation of how to better protect our cities and states against forthcoming climate change. From there, after leaving CDC, he went on to become the Dean of the University of Washington School of Public Health, one of the leading schools of public health in the country. And you can see a shift in his research there from strictly sort of chemical, environmental, and occupational exposures to sort of about health and well-being rather than about disease and where we live and how we live, and how, as he was telling me at dinner last night, how to really lead a happier life, which is what we really all care about. So we're very excited to hear your thoughts specifically on climate and health, so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you to all of the people who have been so nice about hosting this visit here. It's great to come back to Brown. As Greg said, I wrote my bachelor's, what do you call it, a thesis, when I was here on the formation of the Rhode Island Board of Health, which took place in 1877. That was just a few years before I was actually here in college. And so it's great to be back and to see old friends, Pat Nolan, who headed the Board of Health here, the Department of Health for a long time. This is a great state and it's a great university, and I'm really glad to be back. Let me just take a quick pulse check on you. I want to figure out who comes from an environmental orientation, who comes from a health orientation, because I'm guessing we might have some of each from those two units, from IBES and from the School of Public Health, and maybe from other places as well. Raise your hand if you're mostly on the health side of things. So that's a hearty minority, and the nice thing is they're not all sitting together, which is great. Raise your hand if you're mostly on the environmental side of things. Great. And raise your hand if you're from something else. You would identify, so what's that something else?
Computer science.
Computer science, welcome. And there was a hand over here from the...
people in cities.
People in city. Well, this is great. So, and this is actually a very cross-cutting topic, so I hope that we can all find common ground of material that's of interest to us. How many were at John Holdren's talk, I guess a few weeks ago? So many of you, but not all. How many are fairly familiar with climate science? And that's most of you. Good. Because John Holdren was here, and because I figured most of you were familiar with climate science, I'm going to skip it, and we'll get directly into the health stuff. And what I want to do is kind of inventory for you the health impacts of climate change, take the first few minutes to do that, and then kind of pivot from there and stand back and together say, well, what do we do about this? Because simply laying out a bunch of problems is pretty grim. It's a bad thing for a speaker to inflict on an audience. So we're going to try to end on a more constructive note. But I want to begin this story way back at the beginning. My thesis here was in the history department, even though it was an independent major. I got to say something about independent majors at Brown. Mine was called Science and Society. I made it up, and that's what I guess there is a real major now called Science and Society, but there wasn't one, so I made it up. And one of my best friends had a major called the Citizen in Society, and other people are doing Arts in Society. We were just waiting until somebody majored in society, which may have happened. But I was primarily based in the history department, and I spent a large part of my senior year in very dusty Rhode Island archives researching the history of the State Board of Health. And I still tend to think back historically, where do problems come from? So the problem we'll be talking about today may begin here. This is the bottom of a Scottish coal mine in 1860. The UK had been using coal for a couple of centuries by now already, when steam pumps, steam engines with pumps were developed in the early 1700s. They could pump water out of the coal mines and actually dig deeper and get lots more coal out. But by now, by 1860, there is the industrial scale production of coal providing unprecedented amounts of energy to British industry. I like this picture because if you'll notice carefully, the guy sitting down at the bottom of the coal mine didn't wear a helmet to protect his head. He decided to wear instead his powdered wig. And he is lighting something up, which is either a pipe or a firecracker. Either way, lighting a flame down there in the coal mine is sort of a nice example of the reckless insouciance that was to characterize energy policy for the next 150 years. This may also be the beginning of the story. This is the Drake Well. Anybody know about the Drake Well? This was the first commercial oil well in the US, and some say in the world, 1859, northwestern Pennsylvania. And this ushered in an age of energy plenitude as well, but this is liquid energy, not solid energy. This is energy that you can then put in a vehicle and move around with. This is energy that you can distill and crack and make organic chemicals. So this was the other half of the energy revolution. And that ushered in a phase change in human existence, what's been given the name Anthropocene in the last few years. But what you can see in this picture is that sometime around the middle to late 19th century, especially in the early 20th century, our use of energy, our appropriation of energy sources in the world ramped up enormously. And this was the beginning of a great party that's going on for the last 150 years or so. Most of the energy, as you can see, is either coal or oil. Natural gas is the purple there. So fossil fuels, non-renewable sources of energy, and that's what has led to amazing changes in human civilization over the last 150 years. Without all that easy energy, we couldn't have done it. That's, of course, energy that accumulated over millions of years in geologic time, so therefore unrenewable in any human time frame. Well, that, of course, as you all know, has led to increasing levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, which has contributed to the warming of the climate through the greenhouse effect. And I won't say anything more about this because I think everybody's fairly familiar with this. The piece I want to jump to right away is the impact of all of this on human health. This is a cover of the LANCET, which is a prominent medical journal in the UK, announcing climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. I do want to foreshadow a little bit later today to say that a subsequent issue of the Lancet, a few years after this one came out, reframed it. Climate change is the greatest public health opportunity of the 21st century, and both things are true. So let's talk about the ways in which climate change may threaten health. This is one of these diagrams that probably constitutes PowerPoint malpractice. Why would anybody show an audience a picture like this? But I really want you to see the complexity of it all, because the pathways through which climate change affects health are complex. Some of the changes are categorized as primary, indicated by this red circle here, direct health effects of phenomena like storms and heat waves. And those affect health in very direct ways, as I'll show you in just a couple of minutes. Others of the effects are secondary, mediated through ecosystem changes. So for example, the conditions that give rise to infectious diseases may change, and that may change the transmission of infectious diseases. And still others of the impacts are tertiary, mediated through changes in complex social processes. We're talking about migration, conflict, and so on. So a very, very complicated network of pathways that lead from climate change to health. To make it a little more linear and comprehensible, I'm going to show you this diagram, which will be the outline for the next few minutes. We have, I'm sorry if you're sitting way over on that side and you're looking at that screen, and I'm going to point to this screen, but maybe I'll move back and forth for the sake of equity. All of these impacts on systems brought about by the warming climate and by the accompanying Earth system changes then have implications for health and disease and injury risk. So 10 categories of these things, and I'm just going to walk through those 10 categories, not being encyclopedic at all, but giving a couple of little examples in each category, and then concluding each one with, what do we know? Because at the end of all of this, we're going to want to stand back and say, what do we know? What's the status of our knowledge? How much insight do we have about the links between climate change and health? So, number one, the direct effects of heat, the simplest and most direct of the pathways, medically very well characterized from a relatively benign condition like heat rash up to a fatal condition called heat stroke, and well known for a long time. But with increasing frequency of hot days and with extreme heat events, these things become more common. But all of this together is the tip of the iceberg, because when large numbers of people die during extreme heat events, most of them don't have on their death certificate heat stroke. Most of them have a cardiopulmonary disease. People die of other causes. And the numbers can be absolutely terrifying. In the European heat wave in 2003, 70,000 excess deaths over just a week or so. In the Russian heat wave in 2010, 54,000 excess deaths. Probably higher numbers in India over each of the past few summers that have been unusually hot summers, but we don't have good social statistics on those deaths. There's been a lot of epidemiology on heat waves, and we know a lot about the risk factors for dying in a heat wave. For extra credit, I've had 2 pictures of books up on this slide. Which one was written by a Brown graduate?
Heat wave.
Yes, good, Eric Kleinenberg. So we know that individual factors like being old, having certain medical predispositions, being socially isolated are risk factors for dying in a heat wave. And there are environmental or contextual factors that also increase your risk of dying in a heat wave, such as certain kinds of neighborhoods or the absence of certain kinds of services. So we know a lot about how heat waves operate, which is important from a public health point of view because that knowledge can be translated into protective strategies, as we'll get to in just a minute. But in addition to those bad outcomes, people dying in heat waves, heat is so interesting and complex because it does lots of other things, and this is a window into the complexity and fascination, if you will, of the impacts of climate change on health. Violence increases during heat waves, and rates of violent crime rise. That may be true of suicide as well. The data are more equivocal, but there is some data suggesting that suicides increase during very hot weather. Kidney disease rises during heat waves. This is a phenomenon best characterized in working populations in poor areas where there isn't good rehydration and people work while dehydrated. This is the most polite picture I could find to illustrate this particular outcome. Anybody know what I'm doing here? So it's very hard to carry out effective protection of food, food sanitation during heat waves. So rates of foodborne illness increase during heat waves. This is, well, I won't go into detail. Sleep quality is impaired during extreme heat. And when you're not sleeping well, your risk for other conditions like cardiovascular disease rises as well. People diminish their physical activity during very hot weather, and that in turn increases the risk or forfeits the protective effect of physical activity for cardiovascular disease, cancer, depression, gallbladder disease, osteoporosis, a number of conditions. We have with us a couple of leaders of RICOSH, the Rhode Island Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, who are well aware that during heat waves, occupational injury rates increase. Where is Jim? A shout out for RICOSH, wherever. There you are back there. Occupational injuries rise during hot weather. And perhaps more importantly on a global basis, work capacity drops during hot weather. And calculations have suggested that work capacity worldwide has already fallen by several percent and stands to fall by as much as 50% in some very hot parts of the world. Diminished work output in turn means diminished economic output. And for people who are working for a living, growing food for their families or whatever they do, this is a major impact on health indirectly as well. Okay, can we acclimate to health? I don't know if the word is acclimate or acclimatize, but can we get used to heat to the point that it doesn't do us so much harm? Well, yes, we can. Biologically, people can acclimate. You can see some of the physiologic changes that are part of that acclimatization process. There also is a social acclimatization process. Anybody know what that is? It's called air conditioning. And when we have air conditioning more and more widely distributed, then heat waves become less and less deadly for people. In fact, the relationship between hot weather and mortality has declined over the course of the 20th century with the penetration of air conditioning in the market, almost by 70%. But we can only acclimate to a point. Once the temperature gets too high, especially for those without air conditioning, there's no way physiologically or socially to cope with that. These are some pictures of temperature profiles in 2015, and you can see that in the Gulf region, temperatures went up to as high as 164 degrees, the wet bulb temperature. In parts of India, temperatures were up to 118 degrees. So those are not survivable temperatures after a short period of time. That's what we've seen so far. This is 2015. The projections are that that will get substantially worse in coming years. Meanwhile, the human species is becoming more and more an urban species. The city is our native habitat. In the last decade, we got to the point where 50% of humans live in cities, and that's important because cities are especially hot places due to a phenomenon called the urban heat island. So we're concentrating people in the most vulnerable places precisely as those places are tending to get more and more hot. So a major challenge for public health. Now, do we know what to do? Well, we actually do in many ways. There is a set of actions that together comprise heat wave preparedness or extreme heat preparedness. Cities call them heat action plans. For those not in public health, you may not know that most public health activity in our country takes place at the state and city level. So who is responsible to maintain a heat action plan? It's the city health department. So things like mapping your city so you know where the hot parts of the city are, enumerating the population so you know who's most vulnerable and where they are, putting into place heat alerts to let people know that a heat wave is coming, putting cooling centers into place, distributing water, equipping the emergency rooms to take care of large numbers of hyperthermic patients. All of these things and more together comprise a heat action plan, and that illustrates that we actually can cope with some of these problems, at least in part. So what do we know? We know a lot about the biomedical and epidemiologic features of heat, and that's important because if we're going to plan to protect people, that's knowledge that we need. We know that this is a very complex problem, so we need to be thinking about dimensions that you might not ordinarily think about, from work capacity to sleep disturbances. We know that we can adapt, but we know that adaptation has limits, and we know some of the ways to prepare and to protect people. So that's heat. Second outcome I want to talk about is severe weather events. And I want to congratulate all of you for coming to this talk on a day like today. This is perfect timing. Thank you for whoever organized this, and congratulations on your climate resilience that you demonstrated by being here. So there are lots of kinds of severe weather events, storms, floods, and so on, and I'm not going to go into these in detail, principally because it's kind of intuitive. You sort of know what the impacts are on human health and well-being. Injuries acutely at the time of the event, and then some long-lasting tail effects that I'll talk about in just a minute. Many of these events are becoming more common. In some cases, such as the North Atlantic, cyclone is the generic term for a big storm, so we call them hurricanes here, probably no more frequent, but more severe with more energy in the atmosphere. This is a picture of the billion-dollar disasters in the US last year, and the increasing frequency of these is compounded by the fact that we're concentrating more and more economic investment in some places that are vulnerable. So lots of economic damage occurs in some of the big bad storm events. Sea level rise is an interesting phenomenon that bears on these severe events, because if sea levels rise, then you get problems just from the sea level rise, saline intrusion of water tables contributing to hypertension and preeclampsia in people who live there. But if you have a storm on top of a sea level rise with higher storm surges, then the risk of urban flooding is intensified. And many of our cities around the world are coastal cities that are at risk of sea level rise and the consequent storms. So I mentioned the acute injuries and fatalities, the intermediate problems, like if you happen to be on dialysis, or if you happen to be getting chemotherapy, or if you happen to be getting drug rehab, and treatment is interrupted by a disastrous event, then the health impacts on you can be disastrous. And then the long-term problems, when people are displaced as the result of a disaster, lives are upended, depression and anxiety rise, and may be, in aggregate, the biggest health burden from some of our big disasters. That certainly seemed to be the case following Katrina. And this is a picture of displacement worldwide. This was the last year for which this particular think tank created data, 2014. But you can see that, well, can you see? The total, yeah, there it is, 19.3 million people worldwide displaced by disasters in that 1 year. So this is a very big, if indirect, impact on people's health and well-being. Drought is also an issue. This is a picture of predicted changes in drought over the next few decades. And what you can see is that the entire southwestern corner of the country is looking at much more prolonged and intense droughts than they have experienced to date. The redder the color, the more the increase from what has prevailed up until now. Drought is itself a risk factor for a number of health outcomes. Malnutrition in agricultural areas where they can't grow crops and have less resilience than we do in this country to move foods around. But compromised sanitation, dust is generated in drought situations, causing respiratory hazards, and the mental health impacts. Very interesting data from Australia during the last very prolonged drought that they suffered of rising suicide rates in farmers whose agricultural activities were compromised by the drought. And I'm going to mention this issue now. I could have mentioned it in talking about heat. I could mention it in all the others, and I'll try to. All of these impacts fall disproportionately on those who are most vulnerable already. And this is a sort of an axiom in public health, that we're not all equally vulnerable. When it comes to climate change, we're all vulnerable. But people who are poor, communities of color, people who are disenfranchised for any reason, are especially vulnerable. And these heartbreaking pictures, which are Katrina pictures, are a reminder that for any of the disasters, for almost any of these adverse events, there are disparities in who's at risk, and there are disparities in the health outcomes. That's a very important part of the disaster picture, including disaster preparedness and response. So we know something about the vulnerabilities to disasters. We know that preparedness is essential and can save lives and reduce suffering. There's a broad range of health impacts, many of which can persist for a long time after the acute phase. I keep mentioning that, and there's a reason for that. We're pretty good as a country at responding to disasters during the high adrenaline phase of the disaster. Funds flow, people rush in, supplies are delivered, sometimes not in the most organized way, but eventually they get there. But by 3 months later or 6 months later, many news cycles later, interest wanes, and often there are very few resources available for the long-term mental health care and other recovery aspects of a disaster. Okay, next outcome, air quality. I'll go through this kind of quickly. There are several pieces here. One is ozone. Ozone in the breathing zone, as opposed to stratospheric ozone, is bad for us. It's a respiratory irritant. And ozone, as you know, isn't emitted directly from tailpipes and smokestacks. Rather, it's formed as a secondary pollutant in the air from precursors, oxides of nitrogen and hydrocarbons. Well, that reaction is driven by heat. So all things being equal, the hotter it is, the more ozone you get in the air. Here's a picture from Atlanta up above and New York down below, showing the relationship during summertime between heat and ozone. More heat, more ozone. Second air pollution issue is wildfires. The combination of drying out of forests, invasions of forests by beetles, and desiccation of the land all creates huge setups for wildfires, which have been raging in recent years. That wildfire smoke, if you're downwind of it, can be as intense as air pollution on a bad day in Delhi or in Shanghai. Here's a graph of wildfires in the West over recent years, and you can see that this is a very worrisome trend. It's getting worse and worse. And as you project into the future, things look like they'll continue on the same trajectory. The upper picture is 2004 to 9, that's observed data, and the lower picture is projected data for the middle of this century. And what you see is much larger areas that are red, meaning high risk of wildfires, including large parts of my own state here and large parts of Idaho and Montana, which have been relatively free of wildfires up until now. So a worrisome trend. And it's not just the US. This is a picture that is just incredibly impressive of the wildfires in Portugal, north of Lisbon, this past summer. So it really does have an apocalyptic quality to it. But more importantly than the look, the health impacts of this smoke are quite severe, with increases in cardiovascular mortality that can be seen within a couple of days of exposure to the smoke. Third air quality story, and the last I'll tell, has to do with allergies. Now, it would be really great if climate change with higher levels of CO2, which is after all an input to plants, encouraged the growth of the plants we like corn and rice and soy, and didn't encourage the growth of plants we don't like ragweed. But in a divine joke on all of us, it actually doesn't work that way. It's the reverse. So a lot of the weeds do very well, and a lot of crop plants, as I'll talk about in just a minute, don't do so well. Ragweed loves high CO2 situations, produces more pollen, the pollen season is extended, and if you suffer from allergies, you know it. Poison ivy, not really an air pollutant, but since we're talking about allergens, I'll mention it here, grows more exuberantly, and the allergen in poison ivy, called urushiol, actually becomes more allergenic under climate change. So a lot of these processes are going to be worse. This is a picture of the prolongation of the allergy season, of the ragweed season, in several parts of the country. And you can see, interestingly, the season has been more prolonged along the northern tier than farther south, consistent with lots of our observations that the impacts of climate change are manifesting more quickly at northern latitudes than farther toward the equator. So we know a lot about air pollution already from air pollution epidemiology. That knowledge is very applicable as we project what will be happening with climate change and understand what's happening already. The modeling that we do on air pollution and health is very useful in making projections. It's very important to know that if you have asthma or chronic obstructive lung disease or another risk factor, you need to pay special attention to this, and we who care for people need to pay special attention. And healthcare then becomes one of the adaptive mechanisms to help blunt the impacts of climate change on people with respiratory or cardiovascular risk factors. Okay, I'll just say one thing on chemical exposures, and this is again a complicated picture, the main point of which is to show you that in the world of chemical exposures, which is a global set of phenomena, climate change can intervene in many ways, from the distribution of chemicals around the world to changing the half-lives of some chemicals. Persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, metals, a number of chemicals have been widely distributed in the Earth's ecosystems, and some of them are found very, very far from where they were ever made or used, like in polar tissues of animals and people. The news is partly good and partly bad. The distribution of chemicals has changed. Some chemicals actually move more under warmer conditions. The half-lives of some chemicals is reduced. So some chemicals actually go away faster in warmer weather. So it's a mixed picture, and we're only beginning to get some research on chemical exposures as climate change will affect them. You wouldn't know that we're just at the beginning of this from this very sophisticated picture from a published paper a few years ago, but we're really just beginning to learn this. So there's some bad news, as I said, there's some good news, and we still need to learn a lot. Okay, infectious diseases, the next category. This is beginning to get grim, isn't it? Don't worry, we will end on a happier note. We're going to begin with vector-borne diseases, and then we'll talk about food and waterborne diseases, two different categories of infectious disease transmission. The bottom line with vector-borne diseases is that some vectors, like mosquitoes and ticks, do well with climate change. They like the moisture, they like the warmth, and they thrive. So here's a picture just from one particular study of one particular species. Actually, these are a few different species. But it's a picture of how mosquito biology is affected by various climate factors, in this case temperature. And what you can see is that the metabolism is revved up. So the biting rate is accelerated, the reproductive rate is accelerated, the feeding rate is accelerated, meaning that they bite more. And the extrinsic incubation period, which has to do with the time between biting and between birth and disease, decreases. So all of the factors that lead to disease transmission are accelerated. There's a reason that tropical diseases are called tropical diseases. It's a reminder that some diseases thrive in particular ecological niches, and as those ecological niches expand their range, so may the diseases expand their range. The relationships happen not only through changes in vector biology, but in lots of other ways as well. So some of the direct effects are shown here. For example, if wind intensifies, then some vectors which are wind-borne are distributed more widely. As global precipitation patterns change, then you may have, at least in some areas, longer periods of rain with more standing water, which is good for the reproduction of some vectors. So lots of these pathways through which infectious disease spread can be accelerated, and lots of indirect pathways as well. For example, changes in vegetation that affect the distribution of the tsetse fly. So lots of very interesting ecological pathways here. This is not a simple story. But when the WHO took a look at all of the major infectious diseases that threaten the global population, as they did a few years ago, and produced risk estimates, what you can see is that malaria at the top is considered a high risk of expanding its range and expanding the global population at risk. And since well over 2 billion people are at risk already, that's consequential. And the yellow ones, the schistosomiasis and river blindness, are intermediate. So a number of diseases that are expected to become more widespread. This is a cautionary picture. This picture is meant to remind us that this is not a simple situation. So you might have a vector-borne disease such as dengue fever, and you might have a particular ecosystem such as the US-Mexico border. And if you study disease rates, they're highly variable between the north and the south side of the border, much lower in the US than in Mexico. And that's not a function of ecology, it's a function of screens on windows and air conditioners. So lots of social factors, healthcare system factors, and others influence the spread of infectious diseases. One wants to avoid simple statements like, malaria is going to get worse with climate change. It'll get worse in some places, better in some places, and interventions can affect how that happens. But just a couple of examples. This is a picture of the spread of the Aedes mosquito, the mosquito that spreads a number of diseases, West Nile, dengue, and others. And what you can see is that both of the primary species, Aegypti and albopictus, are increasing their range and are expected to increase their range over coming years. This goes from the 1990s up to 2016, and you can see more and more occurrence of these species. Dengue fever is one of the diseases that is spread by these mosquitoes, and what you can see in these pictures along the bottom, going from the 1990s to the 2000s, is a very rapid spread of the disease through the Americas, partly due to the erosion of public health systems, but partly due to ecological factors that favor the spread of the disease. We're now seeing in the US cases of dengue that are homegrown, which we haven't seen for years, so this is a serious problem. And when we look forward, we expect that the risk of dengue will expand considerably over time. This is only one of the vector-borne diseases that will be of importance. Lyme disease is one that's very familiar to people around here. This is a picture. Where's Carl? Can you identify the state?
Well, it looks like Minnesota to me.
Don't you know? And you can see that Lyme disease has spread extensively through Minnesota in recent years. And not only in Minnesota, this is a disease that really began in this corner of the country, up in Connecticut, as you know, and it has spread quite widely. The ticks that spread Lyme disease are now being found in Alaska, which they never were before. And so all of that together supports predictions that the Lyme disease risk areas in the country will expand considerably in coming years. So this is another example of how climate change is likely to be driving the spread in this particular vector-borne disease. Waterborne diseases, you heard me mention earlier that it's tougher to maintain food sanitation during very hot weather. In fact, this interesting study, which you can't tell from the map, showed that if you match up in time and in space severe rainfall events and outbreaks of diarrheal disease, there's a very close association. So when you have heavy rains, diarrhea follows, probably because you wash contaminants into sources of water and you overwhelm the capacity of water treatment systems to deal with that. And we have lots of data that would support that kind of thinking. So this is a picture over the course of the summertime of the rates of Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter, and the diseases that they cause. And you can see that these are summertime diseases. They peak over the course of the summer because they are associated with warm weather. Well, more warm weather would likely connote more risk for those diseases. And in fact, when you look at projections over time, that's exactly what the modeled projections show. So this is a study done of conditions in Bangladesh, suggesting that we will see in coming years substantially more, in this case, E. coli infection. So vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases. Anybody know the biggest, baddest waterborne disease, the one we worry about the most? The one whose outbreak helped form the Rhode Island Board of Health a century and a half ago? That's cholera. And it turns out that the cholera risk zones in the world currently are, as shown in the upper map, in conditions in the oceans. We actually never knew that cholera could be a marine disease, but cholera has marine reservoirs. Probably phytoplankton are a good home for the cholera bacillus. And you can see that down below, the extrapolations from current trends are that large parts of the ocean system will be good hosts for cholera in the future, including, as you can see there, the US coast, including the Pacific Northwest coast. So if you want to come visit Seattle, do it now. And you can drink the water, and it's fine to drink. And then the last thing I want to say in infectious diseases is we can predict, model, forecast the occurrence both of vector-borne diseases and of waterborne diseases, and I've shown you some of the evidence for that or some examples. But still, surprises happen. So in my neck of the woods in the Pacific Northwest, a bug called Cryptococcus gattii showed up. This is a bug that is well known as a tropical organism, lives in soil and in tree bark in Central America and parts of the South Pacific. But it showed up on Vancouver Island, BC about 10 years ago, to everybody's surprise. So globalization, the movement of people and goods helps move organisms. But it turned out that probably what happened was that a marginal incremental change in the weather conditions in one of the temperate rainforest ecological zones on Vancouver Island made that a good place for the Cryptococcus gattii to set up shop. And it was found on land, it was found in marine mammals, and then it began infecting people. So we've had several dozen cases now in BC, Washington, and Oregon of this neurologic and pulmonary disease from a previously unknown organism. So you need to be alert for surprises. You can do all the forecasting in the world, but if you were all part of the public health department, I'd say maintain surveillance and be alert for surprises, maintain laboratory capabilities for things you don't think you have to diagnose, because surprises do happen. So bottom line here, many infectious diseases are weather and climate sensitive. Typically, these are not brand new things. These are amplification of existing risks, true for much of the climate and health space. Climate is only one of many determinants. We need to think of this in the context of complex social and economic factors, be alert for surprises, and use existing tools in the public health toolbox to protect people. We're coming down the home stretch now of climate hazards. Food. I have to tell you, this is the one I worry about the most. As fearsome as all those other topics of the apocalypse are, diminished food production around the world is likely to be one of the biggest impacts that we see. As I mentioned before, empirically, most crops don't do well under climate scenarios. Now, you would think that some crops, especially the C3 crops, would be more sensitive to carbon dioxide fertilization. After all, CO2 is an input to crops. But empirically, when you look at what happens to crops, changes in rainfall, more heat waves, lots of concomitant changes alongside the rising CO2 levels actually function to reduce crop productivity. And so empirically, we see data like the data shown here. Corn, wheat, rice, and soy, 4 of the major food crops in the world. You can see that rice is relatively spared, but the other food crops, those bars that go to the left of the upright, indicate diminished crop productivity up until now, empirically, because of higher levels of CO2 and the accompanying changes. And these are real crop data, as well as test bed data from CO2 enrichment plots of land. When we project to the end of the century, we see more of the same, substantial reductions in crop productivity. And to make matters worse, this is not an evenly distributed phenomenon around the world. You can see that the biggest reductions in crop productivity are in the global south, in areas that are food insecure already. In fact, you actually see improvements in crop productivity in the Yukon and across the northern tier of Russia and Siberia. So if you want to buy some farmland now, that would be the place to buy it. But in parts of the world where food insecurity is the most pervasive problem, this will be an enormous threat. Not only does the quantitative output of crops diminish, but so does the nutritional value of crops. This is really interesting. Pump in more carbon dioxide, and it turns out that nitrogen uptake and incorporation by many food crops is diminished. So what you see here is kind of a complicated picture, but it shows for a number of crops, wheat, rice, field peas, and soybeans, and for a number of nutrients, zinc, iron, protein, and phytate, levels of those nutrients diminish under CO2 enrichment conditions. So we're looking both at reduced quantity of crops and reduced nutritional quality of crops. Will that matter? Well, one projection looked at zinc deficiency around the world and found that the number of people at risk of being zinc deficient is in the hundreds of thousands just over the next few decades from this one particular nutrient deficiency. Now, it's not just carbon dioxide, but it's other things, and I'll mention these quickly. One is pests. The bugs that eat crops, the bugs with which we compete, the bugs for which we use pesticides, are spreading from the equators toward the north and south poles as the zones of climate that are hospitable to them expand. That may mean that farmers need to use more pesticides to make their crops produce, and/or we may need new lines of crops. Also, weeds tend to do better relative to crops, and so the competition between weeds and crops is tilted in favor of the weeds, perhaps meaning that farmers need to use more herbicides. And in addition to those two contaminants, pesticides and herbicides, it turns out that in a number of regions, aflatoxin growth on crops is accelerated by the conditions associated with climate change. So all of that means that the quality of food may be impaired, food contamination may be intensified, and farmers may need to use more chemicals on food, which is not good news. Now, this is a complicated picture, and there's only one message to this picture. Having less food and less nutritious food is bad for health. So there's lots of pathways through which that happens. You end up at child undernutrition, increased susceptibility to infectious diseases, a number of adverse health outcomes. And indirect outcomes, like if you're hungry, you can't go to school. And if you can't go to school, then many of our development strategies that have been actually working fairly well around the world are undermined. So the absence of enough food will be a major threat, both directly and indirectly. A word about the impacts here in the US. We will be more resilient to scarcities in food and rising food prices because we are a richer country. But it is expected over time that food prices will rise. That was going to happen anyway because of a relative slowdown of food availability relative to population. This is a global phenomenon. We're expanding population globally faster than we're expanding food production. Some of that was going to happen anyway, the orange. Some of it is intensified, that's the red, by climate change, which will further reduce food production. That means that food prices will rise, and we won't be immune to that. Now, that matters. This is a picture of food insecurity in the US. Food insecurity is defined by having had difficulty putting food on the table sometime in the last month. This is a US Department of Agriculture definition. You can see that we tootled along at about 11% food insecurity, 11% of our country, which is a shameful number, and about 4% that were very food insecure. That underwent an uptick in about 2008-9. Anybody know why? Yeah, that was the financial crisis, that was the Great Recession, threw more people into food insecurity. It's only just begun coming down, but that is a lot of people. Those are millions of people, including millions of children, who don't have a secure supply of food. And we know something about what happens when people are hungry. By the way, it's important to note that the proportions of those who are food insecure, it's about 12% now for white people, it's about twice that for black people, and about twice that for Latino people. So once again, inequitable distribution of susceptibility. When people don't have quite enough money to put food on the table, what do?
Break in and get it.
Well, there's some of that. First thing they do is they buy cheap food. And you can actually buy thousands of calories for just a few dollars, that kind of an unprecedented condition in human history. But take a look at this. Down here, at the high cost per unit of energy end of the picture, are the foods we tell people to eat, like raspberries and lettuce and broccoli. At the other end, at the cheap food, lots of calories per dollar, is foods like lard. So what happens is people shift away from nutritious and more expensive foods toward lower cost foods, which is likely to aggravate the epidemics we are now experiencing of overweight, obesity, and all the associated health consequences. So we in the US will not be immune by any means to disruptions in the food supply, even though we'll be somewhat insulated. So, summarizing what we know about food, impacts on food production, impacts on nutrition, possible ramping up of chemical contaminants. We don't really know, but we suspect this. Disproportionate impacts on those who are most vulnerable, and this will happen both globally and domestically, and we'll have to be very creative to feed the world in coming years in the face of all of this. Mental health. How might climate change affect mental health? Any thoughts? Are you all feeling depressed now? Here it is. There's one. We'll get to that. One of the ways is post-disaster. When your life is upended, very high prevalence of many indicators of mental ill health. Anxiety, depression, substance abuse, violence, domestic abuse, and so on. So post-disaster, and with disasters becoming more common, the mental health consequences will become more common. A second way that climate change may affect mental health is through its impacts on the severely mentally ill. We've probably all seen people with severe mental illness shuffling around with 3 coats on a hot day. There are problems with thermoregulation that go along with some of the psychotic illnesses. Those are aggravated by some of the medications that we use. And in fact, the mortality rates for the severely mentally ill during heat waves are especially high. So this is a second pathway. And the third pathway, I'm going to introduce by showing you this unlikely picture. Anybody know where this is? This is Hiroshima, 1945. And you're all too young to remember this, but I grew up just after this happened. And a reality of life for us was air raid drills. I'm seeing a few knowing heads nodding. So what we had to do when the sirens went off, we all ran either down to the basement, in my case, or you just, if you didn't have a basement in your school, you got under your desk and you were taught to duck and cover. And you did this and you looked at a part of your anatomy that you ordinarily weren't supposed to look at during school. And that was going to save us from the bomb when the Russians dropped the bomb. So this little girl is looking up, not down, so she clearly won't be protected by her maneuver. And these kids are, their front ends will be protected, but their back ends will not be protected. Well, I'm making light of this, but it actually was not a cheerful scenario under which to grow up. Today's kids are growing up under the potential threat of apocalyptic changes due to climate change. And as gloomy as I've made you all feel in the last few minutes by reciting these dire predictions, there's a certain level of pervasive gloom that even the New Yorker has recognized and has memorialized. This woman says, I got deeply depressed about our planet as if I didn't have enough problems of my own. The perfect neurotic New Yorker cartoon character indicating the mental health impacts of climate change. There's a term that's been coined by an environmental philosopher in Australia, Glenn Albright, called solastalgia, which is the sadness that comes with watching the degradation of beloved places. So if you're a crab fisherman on the Gulf Coast, and if your father did it, and your grandfather did it, but you see the ecosystem going away, such that you can no longer carry on, there's a deep grief that comes with that, solastalgia. Again, one of the pathways through which climate change affects mental health. Mental illness is a huge and hugely neglected problem for public health, and climate change may aggravate it in a number of ways that we need to recognize and reckon with as part of dealing with this problem. Okay, and the last category I want to talk about is the upending of people's lives, displacement and even armed conflict. So we know that from some small places, like Alaskan coastal villages, as you see here, South Pacific Islands, changes are underway. Places have had to reckon with these changes and have begun planning their relocation, a process called managed retreat. But more broadly, there is a large flow of so-called environmental refugees around the world, millions of people who have been displaced, 20 million in 1 year, as I showed you earlier, just from the disasters that year, more from the slow degradation of agricultural capacity and other infrastructure. People have calculated what might happen in the US due to coastal flooding, due to severe heat, and so on. And if you suppose that some of the reasons that you would have to move within the US would be flooding or extreme heat, take a look at these pictures. On the left, it shows the number of days likely to exceed 100 degrees in the late 21st century. And under a high emission scenario, very large numbers of days, over 120 days a year in much of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Southern California, Florida, will be over 100 degrees for a third of the year. On the right side, you see the percentage change in population in recent years where there's been in-migration. And what you see here is that we have been concentrating ourselves as a country exactly in the places where the extreme heat is going to be worst. I could do a similar exercise with coastal inundation. I could do a similar exercise with drought. Turns out that lots of Americans live in the places that are likely to become inhospitable to live in coming years. So we may see a fair amount of potential internal migration as well. I'm going to move along a little faster now. What about war? Unfortunately, tragically, one of the things we do as a species when there's a scarcity of resources is we fight each other for those resources. So there's been a lot of interesting scholarship investigating the question of to what extent do climate-driven changes lead to armed conflict. And it turns out there may be a link. I won't go into it in detail. The Darfur conflict may have been the first climate war. There's a lot of interest in whether and to what extent the Syrian civil war has been driven by scarcity of water in that region. That may be climate-driven. And finally, violence. This is it's interesting how far back this kind of thinking goes. This is a book called Civilization and Climate, which was published in 1924 by the intrepid Professor Ellsworth Huntington of Yale, published by his own Yale University Press. Almost any American or European who has traveled or resided within the tropics, he wrote, will confess that he has occasionally flown into a passion and perhaps used physical violence under circumstances which at home would merely have made him vexed. Now I know what you're thinking. The guy was at Yale, and if he were brown, he would have been much more calm and peaceful and would not have given in to violence. But in fact, it turns out that we probably all have some susceptibility. This is a graph showing the relationship between temperature and violent crime in Dallas over a 6-year period based on a review of police records. And you can see that hotter weather does seem to predispose people to more violent crime. So, huge set of issues here, right up there with the food issue. And here's the summary. All of these things that I just took you through. And I'm going to skip these summary points because I want to get right to a more positive discussion. But meantime, let's just stop and recognize this. How many people before today have felt an element of despair when thinking about climate and its impacts? Yeah, it's actually pretty common, and we probably don't talk about it enough. But I want to offer you some positive messages, and I think these are not just because I have a unnaturally buoyant personality and I'm given to optimism. There actually is basis for optimism. So how do we think and talk about this? Well, in the climate world, people talk about mitigation, adaptation. In public health, we have better names for those. Mitigation is called prevention, adaptation is called preparedness, and we have a lot of tools in our toolbox that enable us to do these things. So when it comes to adaptation, there's a whole literature. There are programs, including the one that Greg mentioned that we started at CDC when I was there, to equip state and local health departments to do what needs to be done to protect people from the anticipated and predictable effects of climate change. This is a kind of an iconic picture for people in public health. It shows the core functions of public health. And without belaboring them, let me tell you that you can map to those functions a whole set of responses that collectively address climate change and help protect people from climate change. So this has been sort of the well-recognized role of public health in tackling climate change. It's adaptation. It's protecting people, essentially disaster preparedness. But also on the mitigation side, lots of good things are happening. In the transportation world, we're seeing an incredible fast penetration of electric vehicles on the market. You can just go to the web and look for a few minutes and find story after story about companies that are taking fast steps, about countries that are taking rapid steps, all to move toward electric vehicles, which, if you green your energy sources, are far lower sources of carbon in the atmosphere than conventional internal combustion engines. Hopefully one day people will look back and they'll say, what, they burn stuff to get energy? You don't have to do that. We are also seeing a resurgence of things like bicycling and transit in many major American cities. This kid who's riding a bike to school at the age of 7, that was 1962, and that would be me. Love the picture. We're seeing neighborhood design, the so-called smart growth approach to urban design, with more density, more mixed land use, more walkability, all of which reduces travel demand, reduces trip distance, and all of which facilitates a lower carbon lifestyle. We're seeing major changes in the energy system with an incredibly rapid spread and incredibly rapid reductions in prices for renewables, especially wind and solar. China has emerged as a world leader with huge amounts of installed capacity of solar and more coming. Now that there's an emperor for life with central direction for a long time, they can probably do it very fast, faster than a democracy could. But it's not just China. A number of other countries around the world are moving rapidly toward rebuilding their energy systems, and that's a very good thing. We are even seeing it here in the US. This is a recent infographic pointing to changes within the US. In the current administration notwithstanding, these changes are proceeding very rapidly. That's a very good thing. Even in the most unlikely places. The most installed wind capacity of any state in the country is where? Texas. Yeah, so boy, good things are happening. We shouldn't be too discouraged. And we are getting better and better at storage, which is going to be a key to switching to the post-carbon energy economy. We're building deep green buildings. This is the Bullitt Center, which is the headquarters of the Bullitt Foundation, the environmental foundation in Seattle where I live. This is a major urban Class A office building. The foundation's on the top floor, the rest is rented out. It takes no energy from the grid. It uses all the water on site that it harvests, just like 2 centuries ago when this spot was Pacific Northwest forest. And this has become a model for a number of deep green buildings. And we're getting better at food systems with locally grown food, low carbon techniques, soil protection techniques, and so on. And finally, much as I love to be here with you, this is something that could have been done without the carbon footprint of my cross-country flights using some of the great communications technology that we're seeing. So this will, to some extent, supplant travel, and air travel is an important contributor to climate change. All of these trends are happening, and that is decoupling economic activity from carbon emissions more and more over time. The upper two graphs are carbon emissions per unit of energy consumption. Down below, energy consumption per unit of economic activity. And in both cases, we're seeing the transition to a post-carbon economy begin. Within the healthcare sector, we have a lot to do. We need to do our part. We, after all, are about 1/6 of the US economy with energy-intensive commercial space, and we are getting better and better at thinking about how to do green healthcare. Let me finish by talking about how to communicate about all this. Why should a health person pass himself off as an expert in climate communication when I'm not a communications professional? Well, we in health know something about communicating tough stuff. We're the ones who tell you to get a colonoscopy and eat healthier food and quit smoking and put on condoms, sometimes all at the same time. We're used to delivering hard news. So should we have a role in delivering the hard news about climate change? Well, I think we should. One of the things we know in healthcare is that if you want to deliver hard news, you better listen respectfully, know your audience, and then tailor messages accordingly. This is basic social marketing. So who's the audience? What does our country think about climate change these days? How should we be crafting messages? Well, we know that we've had a steady increase in the proportion of Americans who believe that climate change is happening. We started off at 71% back in 2008. We had a drop, and it's been inching back up since then. Why the drop in 2008? Anybody know? No, that may have contributed. Was that 2008?
No,
It was later, yeah.
is it the election of Obama?
It was the economy. So people's priorities change. When they're seeing tough economic times, they downgrade the importance of climate change and upgrade the importance of economics. But tellingly, behavioral economics has showed us that when you downgrade the importance of the issue, you change your factual beliefs about the issue. It wasn't just a change of opinion, it was a change of perceived facts. So, but good news, this is coming back up. Another contributor may be that the proportion of Americans who think they have personally experienced the effects of global warming has been on the rise. All of these catastrophes in recent years have had the effect of probably driving public opinion about climate change. More than half of Americans now think climate change is human-caused. I'm passing this off as good news, actually. Almost half of Americans don't think climate change is human-caused. That's bad news, but let's be optimistic here. And when people are asked about their emotional feelings about climate change, well over half, the blue is very, the dark blue is very, and the light blue is moderately, well over half characterize themselves as interested, but large numbers characterize themselves as disgusted, as helpless, as angry, as afraid. Smaller numbers characterize themselves as hopeful. So this is the public we need to be talking with about climate change and bringing along. I'm going to skip this. All of this, I just want to say in passing, marks this country as a real outlier. This is a graph of a number of countries. I bet you all know your flags, but we won't do a quiz on these. This is the scale of climate concern, and that's the scale of climate knowledge. And you can see that the US is way behind the rest of the world, the rest of both rich and poor countries. So we have a special problem here in our country in communicating climate change. This may be one of the most important pictures I show you today. This is a question of how people frame climate change. What kind of a problem do they think climate change is? You can see that at the very top, many people think climate change is an environmental issue. Some people think it's a scientific issue. Some people think it's an ag issue. Down here, people who think it's a health issue or an economic issue. This is important because which issues do you think are most important to Americans? Which issues have the most traction? Which frames would attract people's attention? Well, it's probably these issues down here, not the ones they think climate change is. Corollary, if climate change were reframed in terms of the issues that people find most important and compelling, that might increase people's engagement with climate change. This is a tough issue to engage people on because it's a complicated problem, it's unprecedented. People naturally discount risks, that's what we do as human beings. It's frightening. There's increasingly a mistrust of authority. People don't like to make the behavioral changes they would need to make. And of course, underlying all of this, there has been a very well-funded, deliberate misinformation campaign to delude the public about climate change. And this has been now well documented. So this is also a very partisan issue. Democrats feel very differently than Republicans. It's to our great disservice and unhappiness that this has become such a polarized political issue when it shouldn't be. The Global Warming Six Americas is a stratification of the public according to how they feel about climate change. So how do we communicate? And I'll finish with this. Has anybody ever come across social marketing? This is the application of advertising theory to good things. I'm going to give you all of social marketing in just 11 words. Simple, clear messages, repeated often from a variety of trusted sources. Simple, clear messages repeated often from a variety of trusted sources. So how about simple, clear messages? What we know is that negative framing, which has typified the environmental movement, probably doesn't work as well as positive framing. This is a little bit intuitive. Martin Luther King didn't say this, otherwise it wouldn't have stuck. He said this. So uplifting messages help a lot. There's a lot of literature on how to frame climate change, how to talk about climate change. People propose things like talk about the threat, talk about the villain, talk about the solution. There are documents that list a whole bunch of climate change messages that I won't have time to go through in detail now. This can be studied, this can be tested. There are ways to figure out how best to communicate climate change, both to motivate concern, to motivate behavior change, and to motivate people to get politically engaged and to vote on this issue. We also have empirical data on the role of health as a climate change frame, and it turns out that many people who don't care about the national security or the environmental frames respond very well to the health frame, either on their own behalf or on behalf of their children. So that's a useful frame. And the repeated often, this is one of my favorite political quotes. This is Frank Luntz, who helped get Republicans elected for many years. There's a simple rule. You say it again, and 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 again, and again, and again, and again. And just about when you're sick of saying it, that's when people hear you for the first time. This is a core message in communication. So simple, clear messages repeated often. And who are the trusted sources? Despite erosion of trust in scientists, climate scientists are still among the most trusted sources, but importantly, family and friends are some of the most trusted sources. And one of the major sources in the era of Facebook. How many active Facebook users in the world? Anybody know? 2 billion out of a global population of 7.5 billion. 2 billion Facebook users. We have 1.6 billion Muslims, we have 1.2 billion Catholics, so Facebook is really a big, important organization. Everybody on Facebook has a curated news feed coming from his or her friends and family and co-believers. So understanding those channels of communication and providing messages from trusted sources, either friends and family or health professionals or others, is an important part of the strategy. Okay, and just how not to do it. Being too apocalyptic and negative is probably not a good communication strategy. Exaggerating is probably not a good communication strategy. This is otherwise a very fine scientific journal, and I recommend it, but this was a bad story. Another way not to communicate, this was a paper that was published on population adiposity and climate change. It's sort of a blame heavy people because they eat more and all that food has a carbon footprint and they use up more fuel when they travel and that's carbon footprint. You can either like this or you don't. I think it's kind of a gimmicky paper. But the intrepid British press covered it in the following way, and blaming people and hectoring and finger pointing are probably bad communication strategies too. And distortion is probably a bad communication strategy as well. It says this sign has sharp edges, don't touch the edges. Also, the bridge is out ahead. So balance in communication methods is very important. If we do it wrong, we elicit these kinds of reactions. If we do it right, we can elicit much more hopeful, positive, constructive actions. I'm going to quit at this point. I apologize that I went over. I had many more slides than I thought or should have. So I know some people probably have to leave. I hope you can stay for a few minutes. I hope you can stay for the reception afterwards. But are there any? I should ask Greg for permission. Can we take questions or comments now?